The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness like knives. Judge Margaret Williams felt her heart sink as she pulled her silver sedan to the side of the quiet Georgia road. At 72 years old, she had seen this scenario play out countless times in courtrooms across America, but never had she imagined she would be on this side of it. Officer Derek Mason stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting on his belt as he approached her vehicle with heavy, deliberate steps. Margaret rolled down her window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, a practice she had taught her own children decades ago. License and registration. Mason barked without greeting, his flashlight beam cutting across her face. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why you pulled me over?" Margaret's voice was calm, measured, the same tone she used when addressing attorneys in her courtroom. "Don't get smart with me. License and registration. Now." Margaret reached slowly for her glove compartment, announcing each movement. "I'm reaching for my registration now. My license is in my purse on the passenger seat." Mason's flashlight followed her every move, his jaw tight. "You people always have an excuse. Probably driving a stolen car through this neighborhood." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. This neighborhood was hers. She had lived on Magnolia Drive for 30 years, in the house she and her late husband had bought when she was appointed to the federal bench. "Officer, I assure you this is my vehicle. I live just 3 blocks from here." "Sure you do," Mason sneered, snatching the documents from her hand. "Step out of the vehicle. I'd like to know what traffic violation I committed." "I said step out of the vehicle." His voice rose, aggressive and threatening. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the door. In all her years as a lawyer, then a federal judge, and finally as one of the first African-American women appointed to the Supreme Court, she had fought against this very injustice. And now, dressed in her casual evening clothes after a long day of deliberations in Washington, she was just another elderly black woman being humiliated on a dark road. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle," Mason commanded. "Officer Mason." Margaret read his name tag, her voice still steady despite the rage building inside her. "I'm asking you again to tell me why you pulled me over." "Broken taillight. And you were driving suspiciously slow through this neighborhood. Probably casing houses." Margaret's taillight wasn't broken. She had just had her car serviced 2 days ago. And driving carefully through residential streets was somehow suspicious? As Mason's hands roughly patted her down, checking her pockets, Margaret spotted something that made her blood run cold. Another patrol car was pulling up behind them. The situation was escalating. She needed to de-escalate, but Mason seemed determined to find a reason, any reason, to justify this stop. "What's in the bag in your back seat?" Mason demanded, shining his light through the window. Margaret's breath caught. That bag contained her Supreme Court identification, her official documents, her judicial robes from today's session. Everything that proved exactly who she was. But something told her that revealing her identity right now, the second officer who stepped out of the patrol car was younger, perhaps in his late 20s. His nameplate read, Officer James Mitchell, and unlike Mason, he approached with cautious uncertainty rather than aggression. "Everything all right here, Derek?" Mitchell asked, his eyes shifting between Mason and Margaret. "Just doing a routine check," Mason replied, still holding Margaret's documents. "Found this one driving through Magnolia Heights. Claims she lives here." His tone dripped with disbelief. Margaret watched the exchange carefully. She had spent 40 years reading people, understanding the subtle dynamics of power and prejudice. Mitchell seemed uncomfortable, his body language suggesting he wasn't entirely on board with Mason's approach. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Mitchell asked her directly. "I would be better if someone could explain why I was pulled over," Margaret replied, meeting his eyes. "I've broken no traffic laws, and I do indeed live on this street." Mason stepped between them. "Mitchell, check her vehicle. I want to see what she's hiding." "Hiding?" Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Officer Mason, I'm a 72-year-old woman driving home from work. What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" "Derek, maybe we should just verify her address and let her go," Mitchell suggested quietly. "She doesn't seem—" "Are you questioning my judgment, Mitchell?" Mason's voice turned sharp. I said, check the vehicle. Margaret's mind raced. She could reveal who she was right now, could pull out her Supreme Court credentials, and watch the color drain from Mason's face. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the lawyer in her, the one who had built cases on evidence and patterns. Perhaps she needed to see how far this would go, needed to experience firsthand what thousands of people endured daily without the protection of her status. I do not consent to a search of my vehicle, Margaret stated clearly. Unless you have probable cause, which you don't, because I've committed no crime. Mason's face reddened. Oh, we've got a lawyer here. You people always think you know your rights. That's because I do know my rights, Margaret said firmly. And I'm asking you both to honor them. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably.
Derek, she's right.
We don't have probable cause. Maybe we should. I smell marijuana, Mason announced suddenly, a lie so blatant that Margaret actually laughed. Officer, I have never used marijuana in my life. You know that's not true. Are you calling me a liar? Mason moved closer, invading her space in a clear act of intimidation. This was the moment Margaret had feared. She was a Supreme Court justice. Yes, but right now, on this dark road, she was simply a black woman facing an officer who had already decided she was guilty of something. Her status meant nothing if Mason chose to escalate this into violence. I'm calling this what it is, Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Racial profiling. The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Mason's hand moved to his handcuffs. That's it. You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting. I haven't resisted anything. Margaret's voice rose for the first time. Officer Mitchell, you're witnessing an abuse of power. I'm asking you to intervene. Mitchell looked torn, his youth and inexperience warring with his conscience. Derek, come on. This isn't. This is exactly what it needs to be, Mason interrupted, grabbing Margaret's arm. These people need to learn respect. As Mason pulled her hands behind her back, Margaret felt the cold metal of the handcuffs against her wrists. The indignity of it, the sheer injustice, threatened to overwhelm her. But she had learned long ago that anger without strategy was useless. I'm complying, she said clearly, for Mitchell's benefit. I'm not resisting. I want that noted. Mason clicked the handcuffs tight, deliberately tighter than necessary. You'll be noted as another criminal who thought she could talk her way out of justice. As Mason led her toward his patrol car, Margaret caught Mitchell's eye. The young officer looked sick, his face pale in the flashing lights. He knew this was wrong. The question was whether he would find the courage to say so. Check her bag, Mason ordered Mitchell. Let's see what our innocent driver was really up to. Margaret's heart pounded as Mitchell approached her vehicle. In seconds, he would open that bag and find her Supreme Court identification. The revelation would come, whether she wanted it to or not. Mitchell unzipped the black leather bag and reached inside. His hand froze. He pulled out a document, his eyes widening. Derek Mason's face went from red to pale white in an instant. He stood frozen, his hand still gripping Margaret's arm, as if his brain couldn't process what Mitchell had just said. That's not possible, Mason stammered, finally releasing his grip. You're lying. Mitchell held up the identification card, along with several official documents bearing the seal of the Supreme Court. It's her. Look at the photo. Derek, what have we done? Margaret remained silent, standing in handcuffs beside the patrol car, watching the two officers unravel. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful response. Let them sit in their mistake. Let them understand the gravity of what they had done. Mason snatched the identification from Mitchell's hand, studying it under his flashlight. His eyes darted between the photo and Margaret's face, denial written across his features. But there was no denying the truth. The official seals, the signatures, the unmistakable authority of the documents. All of it confirmed what Mitchell had discovered. This could be fake, Mason said weakly, but even he didn't believe his own words. Officer Mason, Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority she had held for years. Are you going to remove these handcuffs, or shall we continue this charade? Mason's hands fumbled with his keys, nearly dropping them twice before he managed to unlock the handcuffs. Justice Williams, I didn't. Your car was... My car was what? Margaret rubbed her wrists, where the metal had bitten into her skin. Driven by someone who looked like they didn't belong in this neighborhood. No, ma'am, I didn't mean... You didn't mean to profile me based on my race? You didn't mean to fabricate probable cause? You didn't mean to violate my constitutional rights? Margaret's voice remained steady, but each word landed like a gavel strike. Officer Mason, I've spent 40 years in the legal system. I know exactly what you meant. Mitchell stepped forward, his face stricken. Justice Williams, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped this sooner. I knew it wasn't right, But you remained silent, Margaret finished for him. Officer Mitchell, do you know how many times I've heard that excuse? I knew it was wrong, but the but is where justice goes to die. Mason tried again. Ma'am, Justice Williams, if I had known who you were... Stop right there. Margaret's voice cut through the night air like steel. If you had known who I was? So you treat people differently based on their status? Officer Mason, the problem isn't that you didn't recognize me. The problem is that you would have treated anyone in my position the same way if they couldn't prove they were important enough to deserve respect. The truth of her words hung heavy between them. Mason opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to formulate a defense. Margaret walked to her car and retrieved her bag, pulling out her phone. I assume you have body cameras? Both officers nodded mutely. Good. Because this incident will be reviewed thoroughly. She began making notes on her phone, documenting everything while it was fresh. Officer Mitchell, what's your badge number? Mitchell provided it, his voice barely audible. And yours, Officer Mason? Mason recited his badge number, his earlier aggression completely deflated. Now, I want both of your full reports on my desk by tomorrow morning, Margaret continued. And I mean full reports. Every detail of why you pulled me over, what you observed, what you said, what I said. Everything. Your desk. Mason looked confused. Did you think I would let this slide? Margaret's eyes were sharp. Officer Mason, I sit on the highest court in this nation. I help decide cases that affect every police officer, every citizen, every person in this country. And tonight, I experienced firsthand the very injustice that appears in my courtroom week after week. You've given me something more valuable than you can imagine, perspective from the other side. Mitchell's face crumbled. Are we going to lose our jobs? Margaret paused, considering the question. These were real lives, real careers, real families that would be affected by her next decisions. But so were the lives of countless others who had faced similar treatment without the power to fight back. That depends, she said finally. It depends on whether you learn from this, whether you change, whether you understand that every person you pull over is someone's mother, someone's father, someone's child. They all deserve the same respect you would give a Supreme Court justice, not because of who they are, but because of who you are supposed to be. Mason's shoulders slumped. I understand. I don't think you do. Not yet. Margaret tucked her phone away. But you will. Because I'm going to make sure this becomes a teaching moment, not just for you two, but for every officer in this state. She moved toward her car door, then paused. Oh, and Officer Mason? My taillight isn't broken. It never was. As Margaret drove away, leaving the two officers standing in the flashing lights of their patrol cars, she gripped the steering wheel tightly. Her hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline and anger that she had kept carefully controlled throughout the encounter. She had been lucky. She had status, education, connections. But how many others faced the same treatment tonight, without any of those protections? How many were arrested, humiliated, or worse? Margaret's phone buzzed. It was a text from her law clerk, reminding her about tomorrow's case arguments. Tomorrow, she would be back in her row. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her study, the same room where she had prepared for her Supreme Court confirmation hearings decades ago, and began making calls. By morning, she had contacted the police chief, the mayor, her fellow justices, and several civil rights organizations she had worked with throughout her career. The story broke on the morning news before Mason and Mitchell's reports even reached her desk. Someone had leaked the incident, and suddenly every major network was running the headline. Supreme Court Justice handcuffed during traffic stop. Her phone rang continuously, reporters clamoring for interviews, politicians offering support, advocacy groups demanding action. But Margaret had a different plan. 3 days later, she stood in the conference room of the Georgia State Police headquarters, facing not just Mason and Mitchell, but the entire police force of Clayton County. The room was packed, officers standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of curiosity, defensiveness, and concern. Chief Robert Henderson, a black man in his 50s who had risen through the ranks over 30 years, introduced her with obvious discomfort. "Officers, I've asked Justice Williams here today as part of our ongoing training initiative. What happened on Tuesday night was unacceptable, and we're going to address it head-on." Margaret stepped to the podium, her presence commanding immediate silence. She wore her usual professional attire, a navy suit, pearl earrings, her gray hair pulled back in an elegant bun. But today, she wasn't Justice Williams. Today, she was Margaret, the woman who had been handcuffed on a dark road. "Good morning," she began, her voice filling the room. "Some of you know what happened to me this week. Some of you may have seen the news coverage. But I'm not here to shame anyone or to demand mass firings. I'm here because I believe in the possibility of change." She could see Mason in the third row, his face drawn and exhausted. Mitchell sat beside him, looking equally haggard. 45 years ago, I was a young lawyer in Birmingham, Alabama. I had just passed the bar, and I was pulled over by a white police officer who told me I didn't look like a lawyer. He searched my car, made me wait on the side of the road for an hour, and eventually gave me a ticket for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. Sound familiar? A ripple of uncomfortable recognition moved through the room. I was terrified that day. I had done everything right: law degree, professional clothes, respectful attitude, and none of it mattered. Because that officer had already decided who I was before I ever rolled down my window. Margaret paused, letting her words sink in. I became a judge because I wanted to change a system that allowed that kind of injustice to flourish. And yet, 45 years later, I found myself in handcuffs for the same reason. She pulled out her phone and displayed the body cam footage on a large screen behind her. The entire room watched in silence as the encounter played out. Mason's aggression, his fabricated probable cause, his dismissive attitude, and finally, the moment of recognition when her identity was revealed. "Now, I want you to watch this again," Margaret said, restarting the video. "But this time, imagine that woman isn't a Supreme Court justice. Imagine she's a nurse coming home from a night shift, a teacher, a grandmother, someone without the power to make you all sit here today and listen. What happens to her?" The silence was profound. "Officer Mason," Margaret called out, and every head turned toward him. "Stand up, please." Mason rose slowly, his face pale. "I'm not going to humiliate you," Margaret said, her tone softer now. "But I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly. When you pulled me over that night, what did you see?" Mason's voice was hoarse when he spoke. I saw someone who I thought didn't belong in that neighborhood." "Why?" "Because." He struggled with the words. "Because it's a wealthy area, and I'm black," Margaret finished for him. "You made an assumption based on race." "Say it." "I made an assumption based on race," Mason repeated, his voice breaking. "And I was wrong. Not just because you turned out to be who you are, but because I should never have made that assumption about anyone." "Thank you for your honesty," Margaret said. "You can sit down." She turned back to the room. "Every officer in this room has a choice every single day. You choose whether to see a person or a stereotype. You choose whether to protect and serve everyone or just the people who look like they belong. You choose whether to be part of the problem or part of the solution." Margaret clicked to another image on the screen, a young black man in a graduation cap and gown, smiling brightly. This is Marcus Johnson. He was pulled over in Clayton County 5 years ago for driving suspiciously through a neighborhood. The officer escalated the situation. Marcus reached for his registration, and the officer thought he was reaching for a weapon. Marcus was shot 3 times. He survived, but he'll never walk again. Gasps echoed through the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus was 22 years old, on his way home from his college graduation. He had his whole life ahead of him. The officer said he feared for his life. The investigation cleared the officer of wrongdoing. Margaret's voice hardened. But Marcus still can't walk. She let that sink in before continuing. I don't want another Marcus Johnson. I don't want another elderly woman handcuffed on the side of the road. I don't want any more families destroyed because an officer made an assumption instead of a fair assessment. Chief Henderson stepped forward. Justice Williams has agreed to work with us on developing a new training program, one that addresses implicit bias, de-escalation tactics, and community relations. Officers Mason and Mitchell will be the first to complete this training, and they'll be suspended without pay for 30 days. If they successfully complete the program and demonstrate genuine change, they'll be reinstated on probationary status. Margaret nodded. I could have ended both of their careers with a single phone call. But ending careers doesn't change the system. Training changes the system. Accountability changes the system. Officers who learn from their mistakes and teach others to do better, that changes the system. She gathered her notes, preparing to leave. I'll be watching this department closely. And I expect every officer here to hold yourselves and each other accountable. Because the next time someone is pulled over in Clayton County, they shouldn't have to be a Supreme Court justice to be treated with dignity and respect. As Margaret left the podium, Officer Mitchell stood up. Justice Williams, may I say something? She nodded. That night, I knew what was happening was wrong, but I stayed silent because Officer Mason was my senior, and I didn't want to challenge him. I've thought about that every day since, about how my silence. As Margaret walked out of the headquarters and into the bright Georgia sunshine, reporters swarmed her with questions. She raised a hand, silencing them. I have one statement, she said, her voice clear and firm. What happened to me happens to countless Americans every day. The only difference is that I have a platform to demand change. I'm using that platform. But real change won't come from me alone. It will come when every citizen demands accountability, when every officer chooses fairness over bias, and when we all recognize that justice isn't just a word, it's a daily practice. 6 months later, Margaret sat in her chambers in Washington, D.C., reviewing briefs for an upcoming case on police qualified immunity. The irony wasn't lost on her. The case involved an officer who had used excessive force during a traffic stop, and the defense argued that the officer couldn't have known his actions were unconstitutional. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. Her clerk entered with a folder. Justice Williams, this just arrived from Clayton County Police Department. Chief Henderson said you'd want to see it. Margaret opened the folder and found the graduation certificates from the new training program she'd helped develop. Over 300 officers had completed it in the past 6 months. But what caught her eye was the letter attached to the front. It was from Officer James Mitchell. Dear Justice Williams, I am writing to update you on the changes in our department since that night. I won't pretend that one training program fixed everything. It didn't. But it started conversations that needed to happen. Officers are questioning their assumptions now. We're holding each other accountable. Last week, I pulled over a car for a broken taillight, a real one this time. The driver was a young black man, and I could see the fear in his eyes when I approached. He had his hands on the wheel, his movements careful and deliberate, just like you did that night. But this time, I made sure my first words were, "Good evening, sir. I'm Officer Mitchell. I pulled you over because your right taillight is out. Are you aware of that?" I explained everything clearly, treated him with respect, and sent him on his way with a warning to get it fixed. As he drove away, he rolled down his window and said, "Thank you for being kind." Those words stayed with me. He shouldn't have to thank an officer for basic decency, but the fact that he did shows how rare it still is. Officer Mason completed the training too. He's different now, quieter, more thoughtful. He told me he thinks about you every time he puts on his uniform, about what he did, and who he could have been. I know we have a long way to go, but I wanted you to know that what happened that night changed more than just 2 officers. It changed a department. Thank you for giving us the chance to be better. Respectfully, Officer James Mitchell. Margaret set the letter down, feeling the weight of both hope and realism. One department had changed, but there were thousands more across the country. One officer had learned, but countless others hadn't. Her phone buzzed with a text from her granddaughter, Jasmine, who was studying criminal justice at Howard University. The message included a photo of Jasmine in a classroom, and the caption read, "Prof just used your story as a case study. Grandma, you're changing the world one traffic stop at a time. Love you." Margaret smiled, but it was bittersweet. She thought about Marcus Johnson, still in his wheelchair. She thought about all the people who hadn't survived their encounters with police. She thought about the mothers who'd never see their children come home. Her assistant buzzed her intercom. "Justice Williams, you have a visitor. A Mrs. Angela Mason. She says it's personal." Margaret's eyebrows rose. Mason's wife. Send her in. A woman in her early 40s entered, her hands clutching a purse nervously. She had kind eyes and worry lines that suggested she'd carried heavy burdens. "Justice Williams, I'm Angela Mason, Derek's wife. I hope it's okay that I came." "Please sit down." Margaret gestured to a chair. Angela sat on the edge, her words coming out in a rush. "I needed to thank you personally. Not for what you did for Derek, though I'm grateful he still has his job, but for what you did for our family. After that night, Derek came home and broke down. Really broke down. He told me everything, and then he told me things I didn't know about other stops. Other times he'd let his biases control his actions." She paused, tears in her eyes. "We have a daughter, Justice Williams. She's 17, and she's dating a young black man from her school. A good kid, honor student, wants to be a doctor. Before that night, Derek would have had a problem with it. After that night, he sat down with Marcus, that's our daughter's boyfriend, and apologized. He apologized for every time he might have seen a kid like Marcus and assumed the worst." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I don't expect you to forgive him," Angela continued. "But I wanted you to know that you didn't just change an officer. You changed a father, a husband, a man. And maybe, just maybe, you saved someone else from going through what you went through." After Angela left, Margaret stood at her window, looking out over Washington. The city was bustling below, millions of lives intersecting, each person carrying their own stories of injustice and hope. Her phone rang. It was Chief Henderson. "Justice Williams, I wanted to inform you that we've had 0 complaints of racial profiling in the past 3 months. 0. That's unprecedented for our department." "That's good news, Chief." "It's more than good. It's a revolution. Other departments are calling, wanting to implement our training. Justice Williams, what started as one bad traffic stop might actually change policing in the state." After the call ended, Margaret returned to her desk and the qualified immunity case. She picked up her pen and began writing her opinion, her words shaped by experience now, not just legal theory. That evening, as she drove home through the streets of Washington, Margaret saw a police car pull behind her at a red light. Her hands instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart rate increasing. The trauma of that night hadn't disappeared, and perhaps it never would. But when the light turned green and the police car turned down a different street, Margaret exhaled slowly. She thought about Officer Mitchell's letter, about Angela Mason's tears, about her granddaughter studying criminal justice, determined to be part of the solution. Change was slow. Change was painful. But change was possible. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something important. What would you have done in Justice Williams's position? Would you have revealed your identity immediately, or would you have let the situation play out? Have you, or someone you know, ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories matter. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you why justice matters for everyone regardless of their status, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends and family, because these conversations need to happen in every home, every community, every police department. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. We bring you powerful stories like this one every week, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of our shared humanity. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Are you in Atlanta? Los Angeles? Lagos? London? I love seeing our global community come together around these important narratives. Remember, Justice Williams had power and status, and she still faced injustice. Imagine those who don't have that protection. That's why we all need to speak up, stand up, and demand better. Not just for Supreme Court justices, but for every grandmother, every young person, every human being who deserves to be treated with dignity. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of the change we need to see in this world. Until next time, stay blessed, stay aware, and keep fighting for justice.